How do we know they were the best manufacturing practices? They were the best manufacturing practices because they produced the best cars. These cars, when produced and sold by the companies, made money for these companies. And when customers used these cars, they also felt happy about using it. That is why we say that the manufacturing practices were the best. We can go down and understand the tools, techniques, and management science behind these manufacturing practices, but that is secondary. Because if you know what to change, then only you can decide how to change it. If this question of what to change is not answered first, you will be spreading yourself too thin. And this is what Japan did. They were very clear in understanding what needs to change. But then they also knew after some time that what actually should it be changed to, so that our companies kept making money. And this money was then systematically invested back into the companies so that in the future they would be better off. So the automobile industry had a very fierce competitor in America because their products were superior. Automobile industry had a productivity level which was much inferior to what America was showing. That means the cost of manufacturing was high. Automobile industry in Japan had very weak demand. Further to weak demand, the total demand was aggregate of many models. So if one goes down to look at demand of each model, it was still lesser. So economies of scale were not there, and you didn't have much capital. Under these conditions, the Japanese automobile industry decided to go ahead and manufacture cars. And hence, this is a good point to understand how they developed and then come to the driving principle behind these. And hopefully, the same driving principle which drove the Japanese can also drive our industry. I am using Toyota as an example. The reason being that Toyota has been an epitome of car manufacturing. It has surpassed everybody in volumes for so many years, and while increasing volume, it has constantly made money. It has moved its plant across the world and successfully manufactured cars which sell well. It has, in the recent times, developed the most successful hybrid car. That means it is much ahead than anybody else in trying to think what the future holds for the world. To that great extent, it sometimes now is changing the way automobile industry thinks. But the reason why this is interesting is to understand what was driving Toyota to develop its manufacturing system. I did mention that Toyota was struggling to survive in the 50s. So when they decided to improve and Taichii Ohno was brought inside, he started developing a system which was so risky that it was called the Ohno system. Because if it succeeded, it would have been named Toyota system. If it failed, Ohno system failed. Toyota didn't fail. But the reason why it was risky was it constantly relied on common sense, and it kept attacking the misconceptions which were created in the industry. The biggest misconception is you only produce at low cost if you have high volumes. So Taichii Ohno decided to go ahead and produce cars at low cost, even though the volumes were not very high. And he goes on to say that who says that it costs less at high volumes? He says whatever may be the volume, that means whatever may be the limited volume, you have to produce and think of producing at the least cost at that volume. Because any increase in volume will force you to invest more, and that would mean the cost would go up. So he said that at whatever volume you produce, you will have to produce at least cost. And then he developed systems which were both adaptable. If the volumes went up, it adapted. If the volumes went down, it adapted. And we still see most of us struggling with this. So the Toyota production system is based on removing waste and producing the right quantity at the right time at the least cost for that volume. Toyota, trying to work within these boundaries of restraint and low productivity, finally decided that if we have to make cars, we have to make cars which are good in all aspects: performance, cost, satisfaction. Mr. Taichii Ohno was given this responsibility. Now, anybody who takes on this responsibility will start benchmarking or start looking across the world where are the best practices. And when Mr. Taichii Ohno started looking around to see who the leader was and what was the gap and how to bridge this gap, all he found was that most of the modern manufacturing practices were in the US. And when people came back from the US, they told him that the US productivity is at least 3 times Japan. And how the cars were made so fast, and how the demand was, and how the replenishment of raw materials took place. And this was very interesting. However, when he started looking, the best practices in front of him were of assembly line. This assembly line was doing miracles for the American industry. And no doubt, all of us have to give enough credit to Henry Ford, who started or who developed this assembly line concept or flow concept, which has now been adopted across the world. Not only that, it changed the way we think, and the basis of this change led to creation of so many manufacturing practices, whether it was tailor, work management, looking at productivity, looking at waste, looking at stoppages, looking at standardizations, all this, looking at specializations, how to make sure that the work got split nicely. All this is a result of Mr. Henry Ford's unrelenting effort to improve productivity. He was on a mission, and the mission was to make sure that everybody in the world has a car. Mind you, that does not mean that he was a slave driver. all he thought was that what needs to be removed so that he could send more cars out of his factory. He developed his own methods, but all his methods had gained so much of popularity that everywhere in the world people are only talking about the assembly line manufacturing of Henry Ford. So if Toyota had to copy certain practices, where else but to stand up and look towards Ford. Now when you look towards Ford and you see the assumptions of Henry Ford's environment in which he developed the assembly line, Taichii Ohno was surprised that he has none of such leisures or luxuries that Henry Ford had. Henry Ford had volume, and his job was to keep manufacturing as much as possible. Here, there was no volume. Henry Ford had space. Henry Ford had better car designs. Now, Taichii Ohno, if he had to copy Ford, how would he do it? Because the volumes would never justify the investments. It was very clear by that time that a flow line would work only if there were enough investments, and investments would only be justified if we had the volumes. Plus, these flow lines or Henry Ford's assembly line had another very unique feature. Ford believed in standardization. So he standardized the parts so much so that he even went to the extent of saying that I will manufacture one model only, and that also in one color. So you have one model and high volume. There's hardly a market of that kind in Japan. Taichii Ohno, if he had to copy that, how would he? This is where the brilliance of Taichii Ohno comes into play. But before we understand how Taichii Ohno developed and what was his prime driving force, okay, it is easier to first also understand what Henry Ford did. And by comparing these two, we will then come and understand that both of them were driven by certain principles. And if these principles can be understood, then we have a better power to apply these principles to ourselves or to our environment. Concepts don't change. They're very simple. It is the assumption about the environment in which you apply these concepts that make the application unique. So there's a concept used by Henry Ford, applied in his environment. There's this concept which is used by Taichii Ohno, applied in his environment, and we get two different applications. Manufacturing practices are all about these concepts.